Welcome back, everyone. So, good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock, and we're going to open the session on Matter 2, Spatial Strategy. Now, as each hearing session is self-contained and discrete, for the benefit of the recording, I am going to have to go through some opening matters again, so I do appreciate the majority of people who are in the room have heard these things this morning. So the Central and Eastern Berkshire Joint Minerals and Waste Plan has been prepared by 4 authorities. So the reads we're going to call the authorities, and the plan will simply be referred to as the plan as we go through. I'll refer to it each time. My name is Rachel Bust. I'm a Chartered Town Planner, and alongside me is Nick Palmer, who is also a Chartered Town Planner. So we've been appointed by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to hold this examination into the soundness of this plan and produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations in respect of the soundness. So in case you're not familiar with these settings and these examinations, please address us as simply Inspector or Mr. Palmer, Ms. Boss. Can everyone still hear me through the microphone system? So just a few housekeeping matters. Stephanie Street is our Programme Officer, who is sitting at the end of the table on the left-hand side. So Stephanie works under our direction, so she's not been involved in the plan preparation process, either directly or indirectly, so she's responsible for all the administrative arrangements. And outside of the hearing sessions, if anyone needs to make any contact with us for any reason, it should be through Stephanie. If anyone has left the building and returned to the building, if you need to sign in, please sign in at the reception, and that's a building requirement rather than for this particular examination. In terms of the layout and seating arrangements, any members of the public, if any members of the public were present, they would be sitting in the seating opposite us. And the usual conventions apply that the person who's speaking will sit at the table for the matter and the topics that they wish to speak on, and supporters who sit behind. We're fine with swapping seats and hot desking, that's okay. The authorities, we've got two seats at the table because there are four authorities plus Hampshire. We'll continue to use the audio system because I think that will be better for the recording, just in case it doesn't pick up all of the debate for the benefit of anybody watching. The recording on YouTube later. So, no special instructions, turn it on to speak, turn it off when you finish speaking, and don't touch any of the other buttons, as I understand, that will set the settings. We're not expecting a fire alarm. The fire alarm is tested at 9 AM on Monday, so we will need to evacuate if the fire alarm sounds that is not trilled. Its only point is outside the front of the town hall by a fountain. And the nearest toilets, if you've not found them already, are outside the council chamber on the left-hand side, across the hallway. We are recording the hearing sessions. Is the recording in process? Thank you. So the sessions will be collated and uploaded onto YouTube, as I understand, at the end of the hearing sessions. So we're not live streaming as we go along. Is there anybody else who intends to film or record the proceedings in addition? So our role as inspectors is to assess whether the plan satisfies the requirements of the 2004 Act. So in order to be sound, we're looking towards the National Planning Policy Framework, which requires plans to be positively prepared, justified, effective and consistent with national policy. So these hearing sessions are intended to assist us in that regard. And in submitting the plan, the authorities consider that it's sound, and that's the starting point for this examination. So where participants are challenging the soundness of the plan, then you'll need to explain why and what changes would make it sound. So we'll be taking a few notes during the session to act as an aid member as we go along, and that will help us prepare the report, but there isn't sort of transcript of proceedings. In In terms of changes to the plan, once the plan has been submitted, there are only two ways in which changes can be made. Either the main modifications recommended by the inspectors, or additional modifications made by the authorities on adoption. So for us to recommend the main modifications, if required to make the plan sound, the authority will formally invite us to do so under section 70, subsection C of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004. And any modifications that require consequential amendments of policies, and as that's not a statutory development plan document, we don't actually have the power to recommend modifications to the policy map directly, but if it's an indirect consequential amendment, the authorities will put that as part of the schedule of main modifications. So the main modifications themselves will only recommend if they are necessary to resolve problems that would otherwise make the plan unsound. So they are modifications that materially alter the plan or its policies, and in the interest of fairness, they will be subject to public consultation, which will take place after the hearing sessions, and may require further sustainability appraisal work as necessary. The additional modifications are the changes which do not materially affect the policies in the plan, and as I said earlier, they're made by the Council on adoption, sometimes referred to as minor modifications. So the additional modifications themselves do not fall within the scope of the examination, and it's the authorities which are accountable for them. They generally involve factual updates or correction of typographical errors, if any have been spotted. So there is a schedule of proposed modifications that the authorities have put forward. That's on the examination website, and that's document reference ND01, and a reference to the hearing position statements prepared by the authorities. But I need to stress at this stage they are proposed. Any modifications and just that. So our role is to assess whether the submitted plan is sound, and we will discuss the proposed changes as we go along. So in this hearing session, we're going to look at the spatial strategy. Although all hearing sessions for the afternoon are programmed to finish no later than 5 p.m, we are aware there's a council meeting in this room this evening. So we'll take a mid-afternoon break around 3:30 or a little bit earlier, depending on where we get to in the session. So I'm going to lead this session for this afternoon, and has everybody seen the outline agenda? So the sessions are structured discussion, so I'll take this one based on matters, issues and questions which are on the examination website, and paper copies will be available from Stephanie if you haven't already seen those. So both of us are sitting in all sessions. This is Margaret, we're specifically leading on matters 3 and 6. Read on everything else. So we've been asking questions throughout our preparation process in order to test for soundness and legal compliance. So some of the preliminary matters back in April, and then the matters, issues and questions published in August. So there are some matters that we now have seen enough information through the written representations of the hearing position statements, so we may not need to probe any further or have more discussion unless participants wish to make particular points. So we invite people to speak at particular times, but if you have anything to contribute at any time, please take it later on one side. If you can highlight certain parts of your statement, if you're referring to things, if you can give us a paragraph number or a document reference number, that will help everybody keep on top of where the debate's going. So we will remind everybody you've provided all of your evidence in your original representations, and hearing sessions are not really the opportunity to submit anything further. And any comments that you make during this hearing session should relate to points in your original representation. So the hearing sessions form part of the overall examination process. And the examination remains open until our report is submitted to the authorities. And no further representations or evidence will be accepted after the hearing sessions are closed unless we specifically requested it. The site visits, we've already done a little bit of a tour around the plan area, so we have a general familiar perspective of it. We've seen a few sites from the public vantage points, but we may need to visit some sites after the hearings, and we'll do this unaccompanied unless we need to go into private land and need some access. So if access arrangements are needed, these can easily be identified as we go along, and arrangements can be made through Stephanie for particular access. Does anybody have any questions? Right, we'll do some introductions. Can I ask the participants for this session to introduce themselves? I'll start with the authorities. Am I right?
Mrs. Briggs, Planning Policy Manager, Hampshire Services. Ian Tadorska, Project Manager, Hampshire Services.
Will there be anybody else?
Yes, the questions 210 to 11 regarding the SFRA. I'd like to swap Elena with my colleague Sarah Rashid, please.
That's fine, thank you. And for the environment agencies.
Yes, I'm Michelle Kidd. I'm Planning Advisor with the Environment Agency. And I'll be speaking on questions 210 to 11. And also my colleague Katie Bradford also speaking on those questions.
Right, so how are you dividing? Are you going to swap seats or?
Yes, we will do that. I'll be talking about suspension tests and Katie will be talking about the SFRA and climate change.
Thank you, Ms. Lillard.
And Eleanor Lillard from Climate Planning, representing European Property Ventures.
Thank you very much. Right, so on the agenda, it's an outline agenda. I've actually got three themes that I'd like to cover in this matter too, please. First of all, the patterns of growth, explore a little bit on that, and then we'll move on to site selection process. Now, as this is a spatial strategy session, I'd like to try and keep it to the overall strategy and not get too into the individual sites, if that's possible, because we do have subsequent sessions where more of the detail will come through. And the final theme is the effect really of the revised SFRA on the plan. That's an examination document that I'll see that's been put in. So we're going to talk about the patterns of growth. So can I turn to the authorities first, please? And I'd like to understand a little bit more about the patterns of growth and how that's influenced this minerals and waste plan.
I'll start from a minerals point of view. It's quite difficult in terms of minerals because obviously they're only located where they found geologically. So it's quite a different scenario in terms of, well, even going to talk in terms of waste and growth. However, patterns of growth are obviously taken into account in terms of when we look at future demand. So it's difficult to look at it spatially in terms of locating specifically in places of demand. We've been quite limited in terms of what options have been made available to us, and obviously we're going to be talking about site selection process next. However, we have taken into account trends of growth when we try to look at forecasting mineral demand. Excuse me. One element of that is trying to look at how much demand in sand and gravel is going to be needed going forward, and we followed the guidance for looking at figures based on the global aggregate assessment, which incorporates looking at all different types of forecasting That includes population, it includes GDP, that sort of GDP, and that sort of thing, economic forecasts. So all of that has been built into looking at our sand and gravel forecast demand. And obviously that does tie into growth in that particular area in wider Thames Valley, where relevant. In addition, we have had to do our own sort of demand testing on soft sand figures because there's limited data out there. And as part of that, we looked under different scenarios, which also sort of tied in growth, including sort of population, housing, construction demands as well. So whilst it's quite difficult to look at things sort of spatially and locate our sites with that, we kind of more theoretically built in growth, projected growth in different areas and how that might influence demand. But in terms of the selection of sites, that's been more problematic due to the limited number of options available to us. However, you'll note later on under some of our waste minerals policies, we've looked to apply an area of search approach to try and broaden out the potential opportunities that may come forward.
Okay, so on waste, obviously it's less limited than minerals in some ways, but in other ways, waste often has to compete with other kind of land uses, and also sometimes waste planning in terms of land use isn't as kind of far in advance as minerals planning is. Therefore, we did still have kind of limitations as to how many sites were proposed to the Colbert site, and then when we concluded that that was insufficient, and we went on with the preferred waste area approach, again, we were limited in kind of what available industrial estates were that would be suitable for waste uses. So in principle, we did take kind of growth projections into account, and that's in the waste background study. So one of the ways non-hazardous waste was kind of estimated, and its growth was looked at was through the housing projections that the different authorities provided through their plans. So kind of the estimated housing growth was used as an indicator of how waste might grow. So that therefore included in the waste capacity gap and then the estimate for the waste need. However, in terms of taking it locationally into account, we did not want to use it as a criteria in order to have as many waste options available to us as possible. So we only excluded sites where there was a kind of overriding reason to do so, rather than limit them based on whether they were near growth areas or not. However, in order to account for growth areas, we then included criteria in policy W4, specifically referring to areas of major new development or sources of waste to try and localize any future sites to take those factors into account.
Could I just ask you to clarify, please? The plan refers to the policy. Policy W4 refers to development taking place in appropriate locations. Appropriate locations is, I think, is defined in the supporting text. Could you explain, just clarify, please, how does that provide the definition of appropriate locations?
Okay, yes. So appropriate locations is something we've used throughout the plan in both the minerals and the waste policies, and it's kind of shorthand as we, for example, under W4 we say appropriate locations and therefore comply with all the relevant policies within this plan. So the idea is, so we don't repeat criteria from other policies. We say, if you comply with all the policies in the plan that apply to your specific site, then we consider that to be an appropriate location. However, then the minerals of the waste policies introduce additional criteria. So it's not enough that you comply with countryside or biodiversity heritage, but for example, specifically in the waste one, we say appropriate location, good connectivity to the strategic roadwork, and areas of major new development, sources of waste, or markets of types of waste, and then some further criteria as well. So appropriate location is the catch-all for basically all the DM policies. And then for both for minerals and for waste, we have more specific criteria.
Yes, and so in contrast, then, an inappropriate location would be one that does not comply with the DM policies.
That's right, so that would need to be argued as a departure from the plan.
Just in terms of how you've taken into account the allocations of the other constituent parts of the development plan that's not minerals of waste, how have they fed into the preparation of this plan? I appreciate different authorities have got the different stages. Could you just talk me through how you've incorporated those into the spatial strategy element of this plan?
Okay, so like we said, the housing projections have been included in the waste horizons prediction. However, in terms of specific allocations, they then have influenced, first of all, our long list for the waste preferred areas. So some of their proposed employment areas fed into that kind of long list. But then also it influenced where we took sites out. If we found that they were allocated particularly for employment uses that would be incompatible with waste development. And that was particularly the case with Windsor and Maidenhead, who were still kind of developing their plan, and we're looking at all their employment areas, and we're thinking they might have some kind of different and maybe incompatible uses for them. So we excluded those from the longer list of waste preferred areas and didn't include them in order to account for their kind of ambitions.
You've referred to a particular circumstance with Windsor and Maidenhead, and does that apply to any of the other authorities?
Basically, we checked all the long list of sites with each of the authorities to make sure that they accorded to their locations and allocations and proposed locations.
If I could sort of add on the mineral side of things as well, sorry. We've also obviously worked closely with the planning authorities in terms of where the mineral safeguarding was. So as they've been developing their local plans, they've been obviously noting where any of their potential allocations of mineral safeguarding areas and put a note in reference to those allocations requiring mineral resource assessments. So that's something that just sort of ties the two plans together in that respect.
Just picking up on the minerals aspect of that, so that's how this plan has sort of been reflected back onto the other parts of the development, the non-mineral waste developments. I suppose where I'm trying to get to is how have the contents of those other plans influenced this one.
It's a difficult one spatially, I have to admit, because it's really difficult in terms of unless there was this key proposal coming up, unless there was key proposal that needed specific minerals associated with it in terms of a borrowage or something like that, it's quite difficult to then tie specific minerals development to a particular growth area. And that's more to do with markets, which we also then can't influence within the plan. We can have an idea of where the sources of material may well go, because that's a market decision. It's quite difficult to say that specific mineral site will feed a particular development proposal unless it's kind of identified as a borrow bid. So in an ideal world, you look at where the growth areas were, particularly when you know this could be significant regeneration, you can see that, so it's a lot of the town centres. In an ideal world, you identify locations for minerals proposals in close to those locations. But obviously that's dependent on whether the suitable material is there and the options have come forward for us to consider. And as you'll be aware that at the moment, the only proposals that have come forward we've been able to take forward have been in the Windsor Maidenhead area. There were other proposals, including one in the working area, but unfortunately that was not deemed to be suitable through the planning application process, and that didn't come forward. But it's a demonstration that other proposals could come forward in the future across the plan area.
Thank you, that's
I've just got a question. In your answer to question 2.3, in your hearing statement, the first paragraph, you've referred to the minerals background study, document HS 64, paragraph 615 to 619. And that's in connection with a housing-led scenario for soft sand. Could you explain that further, please?
There was different scenarios that were applied to try to understand the soft sand demand. And so what was sort of basic, I'd say it wasn't myself unfortunately to check the assessment, but I had a colleague to do this for me, but they basically looked at the sales data that we've got on soft sand and applied different scenarios. One was based on the housing figures available at the time. We did do a future update on that, but we also looked at population. And we ended up having 4 different scenarios with 4 different figures, which gave us a different range. I think we selected the sort of central figure for what was trying to identify our soft sand demand. And obviously we went out for consultation on those figures, and we didn't seem to get any of indication that was incorrect. So initially we had a figure of about 1.5 million. When we reviewed it and updated the new housing figures that we've got from each of the 4 Berkshire authorities, we did adjust the figure down to about 1 million tonnes. And as I say, we tested that through consultation, and we also spoke to the neighbouring authorities that we were looking to undertake the statement common ground. Yes, it was past housing completions that were being looked at, and the figures were taken into strategic housing market assessment.
Okay, thank you. And how has that influenced the plan itself?
It's been difficult because obviously there's not any soft sand known resources within the plan area. There's identified pockets of resource that have been come across as being incidental soft sand extraction at a recent sharp sand and gravel site within the plan area. But there hasn't been any specific soft sand extraction at any sites for over 10 years. So that has meant that we wanted to get an understanding of what our demand figure could be, to be able to communicate that to our neighbouring authorities that we would be relying on for soft sand supply until such time that a soft sand resource could be identified in the plan area. So it was just trying to find the quantity that we could sort of communicate to our neighbouring authorities. Obviously, we're not one-to-one at any particular authority, so we need you to supply 1 million tonnes of soft sand over the plan period. But it was helpful for them to have an idea of the sort of quantity that would be coming from various sources.
Now, soft sand, did that involve central Berkshire?
That was one of the authorities that came up from a potential source, yes.
just a query. I think you referred to paragraph 615 to 619. I just wanted to double check with you. Are that the correct paragraph?
Yes, rather confusingly, the paragraph numbering commences in that appendix. The housing related figures are 615 to 619 within that appendix, which is appendix 3.
Anything else that anybody wants to say on the patterns of growth? Across the side of the room? No? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the overall approach to the site selection process now, to the second theme. So to the authorities first, there is a reference in your statement in paragraph 2.1 during the extensive call for sites. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the overall approach, and when you say extensive, how much was involved in that, the statement, etc.?
We say extensive because I think we ended up running 4 different call for sites over the course of the plan period. Plan period in preparation of the plan. Obviously, the longer we were working towards preparing the plan and we were going through further stages and we realised we still had a shortfall, we were taking as many opportunities as we could to try and identify sites with the call for sites. The call for sites went to all known operators in the local area. We contacted agents and landowners. Some of that contact details came from ourselves and from operators that we knew contacts, and also we knew the operators that were operating in that area. But also we liaised with the authorities for contacts that they had in terms of landowners, land agents, that sort of thing. So we sent out 4 calls for sites, and that's, for us, that's quite a lot, and hence the fact it's extensive. We also did proactive searches where we could, but it was the 4 calls for sites who had to go through the course of plan preparation.
That's helpful, thank you. You talked about a proactive approach there, that you looked for some sites yourself. So how did you go through that process? Once you've been asking people to present things to you, how did you go through your own site selection, what were you looking for?
In terms of minerals, it was a bit more limited, but we looked at what all the other previous preferred areas had been in the previous plan. Obviously, a number of those have already been worked, but some were still unworked, and we had to look at reasons why those may not have come forward, or whether there were still potential opportunities. Actually, the 2 extension sites we've got at the moment, one of actually are part of one of the existing preferred areas from the old plan, minerals plan. We also found that some hadn't come forward, but may have been developed for another reason. So we did, in terms of minerals, look at what other opportunities there were within the area. For waste sites, we were a bit more proactive in terms of looking through local plans, looking at land allocations. As we said, we looked at industrial estates and employment land to look at what other opportunities could come forward. So it was definitely more of an active search on opportunities through the waste side of things, but we did try and be as proactive as we could on both minerals and waste.
Thank you. So just looking at the site selection process, I appreciate it's been more problematic for the minerals side, waste perhaps less so. But when we look to planning practice guidance, it talks about designating, allocating in the first instance, and then looking at preferred areas, and then finally the areas of search. So I'm just trying to explore, particularly for minerals, how that's been been worked through?
We definitely would prefer to have enough site-specific allocations. That was definitely the preference on the approach we would have liked to have taken in terms of having sufficient sites to meet our requirements. But as you will note, that whilst we had a number of reasonable options over the course of preparing the plan, some of those fell away for various reasons. One significant site, as I've already mentioned, the Wokingham, was tested through the planning application process, was not permitted, refused planning permission, and subsequently the landowner withdrew the site in consideration of mineral extraction anyway. We also had a number of sites actually gaining planning permission over the years that we initially considered them for allocation. And so that significantly reduced the number of specific sites we could look at. We then considered, obviously, the option of preferred areas, which was an approach used in the previous plan. But in order to be able to identify preferred areas, you needed a certain amount of certainty that something would definitely happen in those locations. And we just felt that there wasn't enough certainty in any specific area that something could definitely be identified as a preferred area. So which is why we went for an area search approach, which also we felt gave a broader view of what resources were potentially available across the plan area to demonstrate did not necessarily have to be focused towards Romania, which historically it has been over the last 10 years, and our allocations are, but to identify other resources across the plan area that we felt could potentially come forward. So it's more based on an evidence and certainty point, which was, it said it was required for preferred areas. We didn't feel we could give that level of certainty. The developers, but also potentially the communities that may have been identified. If both identified preferred areas suggest that something will definitely happen in that area, we felt we could give that certainty.
Anybody else have anything on site selection? Okay, we move on to the revised strategic footprint assessment and the final opinion on this. On this main matter two, which is the. So for this, I'd like to turn to the environment agency first, please. If you'd like to start us off on this topic.
Yes, hello. So first of all, we'll look at the sequential test in association with the SFRA and evidence base. And for that, we've had some discussions with the council, and so we made our initial comments at the 19 stage. Last time was comments that we needed to see that a sequential test had been applied. So we're looking to see that that's been carried out, been applied, and then once that evidence is there, then it can be used by the decision maker to make a decision whether or not a sequential test is passed. So in my statement, I've talked about the most recent submission that we've had from the council, which was an email from the SFR update that was dated the 3rd of September. And in an email, following our discussions that we've had with the council, there's going to be a bit more information submitted to us to explain why certain sites were discarded. So we need to see that evidence just to see why other sites, if they were not reasonably available, that's the policy, the national policy is asking is, are there any other reasonably available sites at low risk of flooding? So if there are some sites that we need to know why in plain terms, or why they were discarded, because we need to know, or you will need to know, whether that the site allocations, as we've thought are the best placed in terms of sequentially in flood risk terms, are the best place for that development. So yes, we just need a bit more evidence. We've just got to that point where we just need more evidence for the sequential test. And what are the planning reasons for discarding the site? Because I assume they're at low risk of flooding. Some of them might have been in flood zone 1, which is sequentially preferable, a flood risk sequential test. So, I've just been listening to the last section about some of them already have planning permission, but are there any material considerations such as transport that have been given as reasons for discarding? It's just an example. And then that would need to be weighed up with the flood risk, why that's more into planning in terms of planning balance, why, which ones, that would need to be decided. But that's not something that we would apply, but we just need to see if the evidence is there for the robust evidence base for that decision making. And also, that, some of the sites might be in flood zone 2, which is potentially preferable to flood zone 3, because 3 is a higher risk of flooding than 2. So we just need to see that that has been carried out as part of the evidence. I just need a bit more to see that that's been applied. Yeah. Hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to turn to the council in a second. But I think what we're trying to establish in this particular part of the agenda is the effect of that revised SFRA that's come forward and the effect of that on the spatial strategy. So, if I can turn to the authorities.
No, that's helpful, and it was useful to have the conversation with Michelle and her team on this, and I think it was quite clear from our discussion, reflecting back on the initial SFR that was prepared, that it wasn't really the narrative was there to explain how we'd got to the sites we had. I think there was a paragraph that sort of used to be talked about sites that we moved out, but it wasn't a clear story of what reasonable sites we looked at. That we would have, in some cases, had looked at for flood risk previously, but then might have sort of disappeared in this end SFRA. And I think from our discussions, we realised that yes, that narrative in terms of why we looked at sites and when they'd been lost through that site selection process, which is why in our revised SFRA that we've submitted, which is HS 69A, we've included an Appendix 2, which now lists all of the sites that was considered and at what point they came out and on what basis. So obviously the reasons, when there's been material reasons why they've been looked at, other reasons like flooding, so for example they may have been planning permission, they may have contested planning application and been ruled out, or have been discounted because we've received other material considerations for ruling out. For example, Ham Island, which is a site that we considered at the draft plan stage, we received an objection from Historic England, so we were not going to take that site forward on that basis. So we didn't take it through the sequential test because it wasn't going to be coming forward. It was no longer a reasonable option at that point, so therefore we didn't put it through sequential testing.
Thank you. So in terms of the process that you went for, it was really the other material considerations and then it went to the flood risk? Or was it collectively assessed all together?
Flood risk was one of the elements we did definitely look at when we were looking at suitability for a site, but obviously if it was then we received additional information which ruled it out for further consideration, we didn't think it was sensible to put it through sequential test to compare that site to another, when its likelihood of coming forward could be reduced by receiving an objection from the statutory consultee. So it didn't seem right to continue with the process when it was no longer an option for weighing up that site potentially over another.
That's helpful. Thank you. Now just turn back to the Environment Agency. In terms of the appendix 2, so that lists a series of sites. What are your thoughts on appendix 2? Does that meet with your concerns about having the information on why things were discounted?
I'm not sure we've seen this document. Is this on the examination library? I've written down the number HS 69A. Is that I haven't got the internet here. I haven't been able to get it on my laptop. It won't connect because of security things like that. And so I haven't seen that document and reviewed it yet.
Okay, we've got a hard copy that's not your only hard copy, is it? I've got it. We've got another one, sorry, okay. Just want to give away the one we've got.
Okay, well, I think I'll need some time to review it, and I'd imagine that also my colleague will need to look at this as well for the other issues in the SFR itself and on climate change. There's been amendments for that also.
Okay, so is a way forward, so we do have this kit tomorrow, so
Yes.
would tomorrow be, would you have sufficient time today to possibly look at those and your colleague?
Yes. Yes. But I'm going to give an update. My colleague can't be here tomorrow, but there'll be something in writing by then.
That's fine, I think that would, if that's the environment agency's position, can be made clear to us, and then the authorities may respond tomorrow.
Do you know what time you want to discuss the only because I'd really like Sarah to obviously be here because I need to schedule her in.
Are you particularly constrained in your attendance tomorrow?
Yes, Thursday is one better for me. Tomorrow I've got quite a few meetings, particularly in the afternoon.
Okay, so looking at the programme, taking into account your availability and giving the agency some time to look at that. I think tomorrow morning we should have some time. So it will be the morning session, if that's okay. We've also got matter 3 to cover and matter 4. I don't envisage matter 4 being particularly extensive as a session, so that would give us scope to return to this issue. And that's enough time for the agency to compare notes, have a conversation, decide what your position is, and then they come back and then that will give you a chance to respond to that. I think that probably takes us as far as we can therefore go if you're not able to skim through all that information now, then we can come back to it tomorrow.
Okay, all right, thanks.
The other thing that we have on our list is regarding climate change, but I'm assuming that's going to be potentially influenced by what you're about to read.
Yes, it will be. Okay, yeah. If there's any general questions, then ask. Okay, yes, the queries that we have have been answered. Instructions.
Yes, there's only one question that we've got in relation to So more general climate change one. In the schedule of your proposed modifications, you've got another two down as an extra criterion to ensure the alignment between the social strategy, vision and strategic objectives. I've just got a question in relation to that in terms of how does that address soundness in your position as the officer? Would you be comfortable with that as a proposed modification?
Sorry, where is that? Which section is that? Is anybody have said one as well?
So that's amendment 2. Have you got a copy of the schedule of proposed main modification?
Yeah, I haven't.
Okay.
I've sent them.
Right, okay. So as part of what you're about to look at, if you just have a look at that as well.
Okay, we'll have time to look at that as well.
Yes, if you want to take the time to look at that as part of also looking at the appendices and the revised sets of RA, we're comfortable with bringing that back tomorrow and just reflect on that. So we'll pick those two issues up, the revised set of RA, appendix 2 tomorrow with the agency, and also make modification to into our morning session.
Could I, whilst we've got Sarah here, would it be helpful though if we talked through the approach that's been taken? Would that be helpful whilst, in terms of having everyone present, could we talk through the approach that we've taken to the climate change allowance? Just, if we can go around and great, it might be helpful potentially if Sarah talks through the approach.
I think that would be a very helpful suggestion, and that would give the context, if you wouldn't mind. Because we're particularly interested in the effect of the revised SFRA on the overall plan, so if you give us some overview, that would be great.
Okay, so we did look at the climate change allowances for all the different sites, and the climate change, the impacts of climate change for sites over this sort of duration become more critical when you're looking at sites within flood zone 3, because that's when you can push from flood zone 3A towards flood zone 3B, which brings in additional requirements and considerations. We didn't have many sites in flood zone 3A, so there's only a few that needed to be looked at in that additional detail. And what we did is we followed the approach that was approved for Heart District Council's strategic flood risk assessment, which was signed off last year. And that took the extent of flood zone 2 to be a precautionary extent for the impacts of climate change. So we could see which of those sites are likely to go from 3A into 3B. And essentially that was because we didn't have more detailed modelling to hand, and we couldn't achieve that within the timeframes that we had. And that also meshed with the Environment Agency's guidance for the effects of climate change, particularly on water compatible development. Hopefully that gives a bit more context to our approach.
Yes, thank you very much. That's very useful. Okay, well, in view of where we've got to, I think that's probably as far as we can go today.
So I would defer it, Mr. Novick,
Have you got any points to make?
No, I think everything was covered in our statement.
Okay.
Okay. So on that basis, if no one's got anything else that they want to say, that wanted to accept those aspects that we will return to tomorrow, and we'll do that tomorrow morning, then we'll adjourn. It's 2:55 and we'll adjourn until 10 AM tomorrow.